Tonight's program is part of our When Science Meets Art series. For over 6 years now, we've been experiencing the work of people who are stretching the boundaries between art, science, and technology. In the new Art Science Gallery next door, our goal is to provide perspective-shifting exhibits that explore how science and technology are shaping our lives, our culture, our world. It's been a true honor to exhibit the work of tonight's special guests based on their latest book, What I Eat, Around the World in 80 Diets. Peter Menzel is an award-winning photojournalist known for his coverage of international feature stories on science and the environment. His award-winning photographs have been published in numerous locations, including Time, National Geographic, the New York Times Magazine, and Paris Match. Faith DeLucio is a former award-winning television news producer, and she was the editor and lead writer for the book publishing imprint Material World Books. So Peter shoots the pictures and Faith does the writing, and they've been collaborating for the past 20 years as husband and wife and as the intrepid creators of books that provide profound glimpses into our own global community. Their first project, Material World, A Global Family Portrait, examined the lives and material goods of a statistically average family in each of 30 nations. Recently, they've been telling the human story through food. First came Hungry Planet, What the World Eats, which chronicled the weekly diets and food costs of families in 24 countries. Then came What I Eat, Around the World in 80 Diets, which showcases individuals from around the globe with the food and calories they consume in one day. Peter and Faith's books bring the world a little closer. With images that transcend language, the books and the exhibits based on them offer windows into the everyday lives of other people, and they invite us to examine our own in a new way. It really is a privilege to have them here at the Museum of Science. They've just returned from Burma, flew right away to Boston, so they're totally jet-lagged, and Faith has really almost got no voice. But please join me in giving them a very warm welcome. Peter Menzel and Faith DeLucio.
Thank you, everybody. That was a very nice introduction. I guess she's talking about us. But we're going to...
I'm going to give you a sense right now of what my voice sounds like. I'm going to really try and project, but I've got major airplane throat. Sorry about that in advance.
But as Lisa was saying, we just returned from Southeast Asia a few days ago and want to share some very recent images with you. So we're going to have a 3-minute travelogue here in the beginning and warm you up for the major show which will follow. On Monday, we were in Yangon, also known as Rangoon, in Myanmar, also known as Burma. And Yangon is a sprawling metropolis like many big cities in Southeast Asia. The country was closed for a long time, but quite recently the military government began softening up. And the huge gold leaf-covered Buddhist Shwedagon pagoda in the center of the city sets it apart as a must-see destination. And we were so intrigued that we visited it 3 times during our short period there. At dawn, when the monks walked around, they also walked around the top of the pagoda. So you get an idea of the size of this thing here by looking at how much gold leaf there is here. And all day and into the night, monks and lay people made offerings of flowers and food, candles and money. And at dawn, many of the offerings were food offerings at the various smaller shrines surrounding the pagoda. What the gods didn't consume, the birds quickly did. But Myanmar is changing, and the government has recently released numerous political prisoners, and restrictions on the press are being eased as well. There's upcoming elections in the month of April. But the ancient heart of the country really may reside on the dry central plain of Bagan, where more than 2,000 of the 5,000 ancient pagodas still remain standing. We found a good way to see the sights, and that was from the air at dawn. There were only several dozen pagodas as big as this one, But nearly all of them, all of the other 2,000, including the smaller ones, have some very large Buddhas inside. And we thought this valley was just as spectacular or more so than the Angkor Wat Temple Complex ruins in Cambodia. So this should be on everybody's bucket list. Bordering Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand is another gem of a country, and that's Laos. We went there last year to add to our collection of typical people with one day's food, and we shot this young mother and her family's traditional kitchen in the ancient capital of Luang Prabang. And Luang Prabang's at the confluence of the Mekong and Quang Cao rivers, and it was so charming that we brought our 4 sons and some of Faith's brothers and sisters there for a week-long get-together at the end of January this year. Formerly colonized by the French, Laotian food is really quite tasty in itself, and the street food is pretty good. The tropical fruit smoothies, though, are just worth the trip. Plentiful and really expensive. They're about 75 cents.
Inexpensive.
Did I say cheap?
You said expensive.
Oh, expensive, sorry. Laos scores high in our book because of the French influence on the cuisine, and the East-West fusion is really quite successful, and there are dozens of really good restaurants in Luang Prabang. The country's saturated with thousands of Buddhist temples, each occupied by anywhere from a handful to a score of monks, and the monks in the temples emerge every morning at dawn and walk through the streets of all the towns and villages collecting food alms from the locals. Mainly sticky rice, vegetables, and occasionally some meat or sweets. The ritual is called takbat, which means making merit. And in the villages, the monks and novices will stop at some of the houses and chant a blessing after receiving some alms. Then they return to their wat, or their temple, where they have breakfast, eating communally. And in the evening, there are prayers followed by another meal. We're heavily into food here. And here's our family chowing down, having a great time at a restaurant, one of the many local great restaurants. Then we went biking through the town and surrounding villages, boating on the Mekong and kayaking on the Quang Cao River. Laos is a great place with great food and friendly people.
Are you doing an ad?
Yeah, I am. The Laotian government maybe will sponsor our next trip.
Just checking. Okay.
Okay.
Now I'm going to try and talk. So we wanted to just include those pictures to give you a little taste of what we just did. But first off, what we really want to do is to thank the Museum of Science Boston, its tremendous staff and patrons, and really all of you for being here, for the opportunity to present our work. A word before we begin. The people that we cover here place deep trust in us, a trust that we don't treat lightly. It's really important as you meet the people that we focus on in this presentation this evening, that you remember that their story at the point we covered them could well be different now. In many cases with people whom we've kept in touch, we know that the stories are different. We really use their stories to provide a narrative for you through some of our travels and some of what we've learned. So now when the lights come down, beautiful. This is going to be hard. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now for the next bit of time, you guys are going to have to do some work because we are going to show you more images than we normally show in this period of time. It's going to be over 500 images very quickly to present ideas and concepts that we have gleaned from our work around the world. If we get ahead of ourselves, we'll back up a bit. We can see the images here on our screen. So in theory, that shouldn't happen, but this one sometimes gets an itchy trigger finger, and since we're married, I will be poking him a lot.
So, Faith and I are independent journalists who take a single idea, something fresh and interesting that we're curious about, and shape it into a question that we ask and illustrate in homes across the planet. These are questions like, what do statistically average families own from one country to the next? And how does that compare from one country to the next? Who still eats insects, and do they taste good? Well, I thought they did.
And I thought they didn't.
What constitutes a week's worth of food for families around the globe, and how much does it cost? And then there's the latest question, what constitutes a day's worth of food for individuals across the planet, and how many calories is that total?
So Peter and I spend our lives exploring humanity and all of its messy, complicated, raucous, cacophonous, strange, and wonderfully random symmetry. One of our favorite subjects is food at the most personal level. Food is instant entree into the inner sanctum of the family unit. There are many things that we humans can do without, but everyone has to eat, and just about everyone likes to talk about it. Food is impacted by culture, by geography, by economics, and by personal taste. And what we do is we work to present the material that we gather as non-polemically as possible so that we don't just bounce around in our own little echo chamber. This really is the key, as the work then stands as a point of embarkation and discovery, one of comparison and contrast, which allows people to compare one to another and to themselves, rather than one of admonishments and dictates. It's really a less invasive way to help people understand some basic truths about what they're eating. We have interviewed and photographed literally hundreds of families in their homes and kitchens in more than 80 countries over these last 2 decades to talk about food, document daily life, eat together, compare notes, and over time to develop interesting comparisons to help our fellow humans learn something about the world and about themselves. We use real people and their stories to illustrate abstract principles, which helps make complex ideas and concepts more easily understood. What we do is we sort of develop a compendium of anecdotes rooted in research, and we're going to focus today on the end results of our documentary work.
When most of us talk about malnutrition, this is what we envision: shocking images that temporarily burn into the public psyche of places far removed from our daily lives. At times, it's a roll of the dice with Mother Nature, but all too often there are political reasons for being poorly fed. Civil unrest, tribal warfare, landmines, they all wreak havoc. Farmland becomes inaccessible and dangerous, and transportation very risky. It actually takes very little to unlink the food chain. Sometimes that chain remains unlinked for many years, as it has in the Congo, Sudan, and in Chad, where we did coverage in a refugee camp on Chad's border with Sudan. A famed aphorism of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen provides some insight. In the history of the world, there has never been a famine in a functioning democracy. Unfortunately, there's a shortage of those in Africa. The Beijing refugee camp here is just one of many and houses thousands of political refugees from the Darfur region of Sudan, like this woman sifting the sand for millet dropped during the camp's food distribution. She's trying to get extra food for her family, grain by grain. But there's another grand unlinking of that now proverbial food chain taking place. At the turn of the new millennium, the World Watch Institute did statistical analysis and reported that for the first time in recorded history, there were just as many overfed people as underfed on the planet. An extreme illustration? Well, there's a new passion for some in the United States. It's competitive eating. This is a competitive eating contest with big prize money as a reward. This one is in New York City in Times Square for eating the most pizza in 10 minutes. Mostly, though, overeating is just a regular part of everyday life. Even though growing numbers of Americans and others in the so-called developed world are finding themselves with less and less money to buy food and are going to bed hungry at night, many of us in richer countries are eating ourselves to death. Nowhere is this more apparent and true and well documented than in the United States, where we like to quantify everything and then largely ignore the results. The National Center for Health Statistics reported not long ago that over 34% of Americans now are obese. 75% of those thought that they were merely overweight. This is an animation depicting the rise in obesity in Americans over the last 20 years, statistics from the U.S. Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. The color changes correspond to the increase in obesity in the United States among American adults, from white to blue to beige, then orange, then red, as obesity increases. This is also a warning for much of the rest of the developed world, which is heading in this direction, and much of the developing world is headed here as well.
So we discovered the original seed of the idea for our work about food in a remote place during the 1990s on the western side of Papua New Guinea. At the time it was called Irian Jaya, now it's Papua, a fractious part of the Indonesian archipelago. We spend about half of every year working outside the US, and at this time we were working here in the Asmat, one of the world's biggest, hottest swamps. We were deep in the jungle watching families process starch from the sago palm tree to make sago flour, the staple food of these hunter-gatherers. Each time these families cut a tree down, about one a week, they'd leave part of it to rot. When they returned, they'd harvest the fat, juicy grubs. And then, of course, they would roast them and eat them. One day, though, we came upon a man and his sons carrying a package of instant ramen noodles. Logging money had begun to trickle into this remote area, and with it, the first merchant selling manufactured food and snacks. We watched as the older boy ate the dry noodles and the other ate the dry flavor packet. Now, these are people with serious nutritional deficiencies, and you don't have to be a food activist to wonder if it's a good idea for people already struggling to get basic nourishment to dose themselves with jolts of sugar, salt, and artificial flavor. Carbonated soft drinks like Coke and Pepsi had arrived as well, and we began to wonder what in the world everyone else on the planet was eating and set forth to find out.
Billions still eat indigenously, or at least traditionally, but their numbers are decreasing. There's an important term that depicts a current global phenomena. It's called nutrition transition. That's when advances in technology and transportation, along with rising incomes, cause humans to replace their simple, traditional diets with more food from animal sources and highly processed foods and sweets from the global marketplace. Couple this with less and less physical activity, and for many of us, obesity and other diet-related illnesses are almost inevitable. The rosy picture painted by purveyors of commercial agriculture is often less rosy than gray. From huge feedlots to slaughterhouses to a typical hamburger factory like this one in Minnesota, we see where the trimmings and the less desirable outer cuts of hundreds of cows get mixed together. A veteran meat grinder there told us that he always cooks his burgers until they're very well done because there's too much risk of food poisoning from fecal matter in commercial hamburgers. The bacteria has to be killed with lots of heat. Why? Well, agriculture is now a big business, and as you know, food was traditionally grown on small and mid-sized family farms all across the planet. Farmers raised both plants and animals and used manure to fertilize their crops. This was labor-intensive but sustainable agriculture. Today in the USA, these farms are in the minority. CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, dominate animal production. Beef, pork, chicken, and turkeys are all produced with high-tech methods and deconstructed just as efficiently on precision disassembly lines. Dairy products and eggs follow suit. This economic efficiency means more affordable animal products, but consumers often pay an unexpected price by ingesting residual additives, hormones, and drugs, while the environment tries to absorb the runoff from the waste of the CAFOs. Factor in the environmental costs of irrigation and over-irrigation, and the chemical drift and residues from pesticides and herbicides, the over-dependence on petrochemical fertilizers to maintain high yields, and now the possibility for contamination of the food supply on a number of levels is much, much higher. Today, in this country, we consume 250 pounds of meat per person. The rest of the world is catching up. Even though much of the meat in the world, even though in much of the world meat is still a condiment or a flavoring and not a main dish, an increasingly wealthy developing world is eating more and more meat, and health is impacted when people eat too much of it. It also impacts land use and grain production as more and more grain is devoted to feeding animals instead of people. We'll look at a number of examples from around the world of global diet change. We touch on production, but we concentrate on consumption because we aim our work at informing the consumer, who we hope that with smarter personal decisions will drive production in a healthier direction for them and the environment.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to run through some of our Hungry Planet family portrait images here very quickly. This is a flavor of our earlier work, and then what we're going to do is pull a few of these out for a closer look, for some comparison. We designed the Hungry Planet project as a snapshot, a moment in time for 30 families in 24 countries, and what they were eating in the course of 1 week. As Lisa said, the centerpiece is a food portrait of the family surrounded by a week's worth of their groceries, and in the book we support that food portrait with an essay about life, habits, and culture, a complete grocery list for that 1 week, and perhaps the most interesting of all, its total cost. The Culinary Atlas of the Planet at a Time of Extraordinary Change. We discovered that the work resonates with readers of all ages, largely because it begins discussions. It doesn't end them. It might be a search for brand names, for instance, or the ratio of packaged food to fresh produce that families eat in the course of a week. Certainly, we have our own favorite points of discovery. Who had the most bottled beverages? Our German family. The most meat? Our Aboriginal Australian family, the Browns. Who ate the most packaged and highly processed foods? Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was our American families, despite efforts by each of them to bring good, healthful food into their diets. Which of our families knew the most about what they ate? It turned out that it was largely those who ate basic foods, things like grains, produce, and beans, rather than highly processed packaged food, as you might imagine. This was as true for Susana Mendoza here in Guatemala and her family's fruit and vegetable-based diet, as it was for Fatimata and her co-wife Palma in Mali of their grain-based diet. Although, to be fair, those with a less varied diet have less to calculate. The more highly processed food in the diet, the less likely people know their intake, and this, over time, creates a very slippery nutritional slope. It's a slippery economic slope as well. The commonly held belief that fast food and highly processed food are a cheaper alternative than a meal cooked at home using basic ingredients really just isn't true, even for the impoverished. Mark Bittman's New York Times op-ed piece late last year comparing the cost of a fast food dinner for four with the cost of a complete home-cooked chicken dinner did a great job of trashing that notion. A home-cooked dinner of pinto beans and rice cost even less. In Istanbul, Melahat Çelik's children plead for Western fast food. It's too expensive, she tells them. She told us that she can make breakfast, lunch, and dinner for her family of 6 for the same price as one meal for them at McDonald's. It's not surprising that this is an easy calculation for her. 60 to 80% of people's income in the developing world is spent on food, making it a family's greatest single financial outlay. This is a huge number in comparison with the US, which is closer to 18 to 20%. But do we know what we're spending our 20% on? In North Carolina, the Revis family didn't know before, but they sure know now. They learned the truth about their diet when we covered them and their week's worth of food for Hungry Planet. Just before we met them, the Revises had joined a health club to lose weight and get fit, but taking on this new gym activity left them less time to make home-cooked meals, and they suddenly found themselves eating even more fast food than they had been before. Their food portrait table, full of highly processed, oversugared food, shocked them. They used the work with us as impetus, they say, to renew their efforts to eat healthfully and mindfully. It's both interesting and instructive that it was mostly those in the US and in Europe who expressed dismay after seeing what they were eating in 1 week's time.
In just a decade, there's been a seismic change in eating habits in China. We covered 2 families there for Hungry Planet, one rural and one urban, and they couldn't be more different. The Suis, 2 hours outside of Beijing in the countryside, eat mostly unbranded traditional food cooked at home, much as we've seen people do throughout our years of covering China. The Dongs, who live in Beijing, eat from the global marketplace, shopping at a new, modern, supersized international supermarket that didn't exist in China a decade ago. Their one-stop shopping cart holds their traditional essentials, rice, eggs, and fresh vegetables, but as their nutrition transitions, it also holds the new essentials, 3 flavors of Haagen-Dazs, fresh whole milk, beef flank, sushi, and baguettes. The per-person consumption of meat by the Chinese has now surpassed that of Europeans.
As you said earlier.
As I said earlier. Both families have added a lot of more meat to their diets in recent years. Only the Dongs include American fast food. KFC is one of the Sun's favorite restaurants, and only a few years ago, 3 of them were opening a week in mainland China. Now it's 1 a day. Only one of the Suis has ever eaten in a restaurant, though. The family still cooks traditionally in their outdoor kitchen, 3 meals a day. And Grandfather Sui said to us, we really don't waste food. He's a child of the Cultural Revolution and he remembers eating grass when there was nothing else to eat.
So just as it is in China, fast food is a growth industry worldwide. All multinational food corporations have to find new markets in order to grow, and they're targeting the developing world looking for new business. despite the fact that most people have very little extra money to spend in the global marketplace. So what happens is fast food companies hand out coupons with very steep discounts, expecting that as income rises, expenditures for their food will as well. Some companies make their product more available by selling it in single-serving packets, seemingly cheaper in smaller quantities, but actually more expensive in the long run. Things like imitation cheese spread, a single broth cube, or a few chips. There are, of course, good things that come from improved food technology, bigger yields, fortification, longer shelf life. Unfortunately, all of food science gets a bad rap because some big food companies have gotten greedy, repackaging basic ingredients into new concoctions, making them far more expensive, and in many cases generally unhealthy. For people like the Cabana family here in Manila, who live a meager life and earn a living renting the tiny hardscrabble rooms of their house to other impoverished Filipinos. The problem is also that much of what's new, coveted, and highly marketed is highly processed, high-calorie, and manufactured, what the writer Michael Pollan calls edible food-like substances, and they're making inroads into diets worldwide. Alma Casales and her family in Cuernavaca have a table full of fresh, beautiful produce, but what people comment about most often when they look at this picture is that row of 2-liter Coca-Cola bottles in the back. Remember, this is their 1 week's worth of food, and that's 5 gallons of soda. When we met them, the Casaleses were drinking Coke for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and it had replaced drinking water in their diet. Alma was, in fact, surprised to learn when I told her that Coke consists solely of sugar water. She thought that it must have some nutrients in it if a company is allowed to sell it. Lest you think the Casaleses are an anomaly, Mexico ranks #1 in the world in per person consumption of Coke, and it's now being sold there in 3-liter bottles. But it's not just food from the global marketplace that's making them fat. Traditional Mexican cooking is great fuel for the physically active, but like many cultures in transition, many of Mexico's people are not. Fewer people have physically demanding jobs, and more have no job at all. The World Health Organization says that 65% of the population of Mexico is now obese or overweight, just behind the US, and type 2 diabetes figures are skyrocketing. So even before we finished Hungry Planet, we began to field test the project that the Museum of Science Boston here pulled from and curated so evocatively, What I Eat, focusing on what individual people around the world eat in the course of 1 day's time. A Japanese sumo wrestler here in his training facility with his day's worth of food trains with his stablemates in advance of a big tournament. The younger, thinner sumo cook together and then force-feed themselves to bulk up to champion size. A Bangladeshi seamstress, Ruma, who sews your American jeans in a downtown Dhaka factory, uses the folds of her sari to shield her small lunch of potato curry from the rising dust on crowded Dhaka streets. At the end of the month, when the money runs low, there's no lunch at all to protect. In Kenya's Great Rift Valley, a Maasai mother draws a half cup of milk from a drought-stricken cow to mix with porridge for her herdsmen and her children. There'll be no breakfast for her this morning because there isn't enough to go around. A U.S. long-haul trucker from Mississippi stops his 18-wheeler for a deep-fried dinner and a rest at a truck stop in Illinois. These are among the scores of people from 30 countries who agreed to share with us both what they eat and the details of their lives. So we're going to show you these fast, and then we'll pull a few out for a closer look.
We covered well over 100 people, then widowed the list to 80. We used a typical recent day as a starting point for our interviews, which then led to the food list and the calorie count and the final food portrait. The people we're showing here are in alpha order by country, but in the book we use the calorie totals to order everyone from lowest to highest, which sets up some interesting juxtapositions. We specifically chose not to cover daily caloric averages as we wanted to include some extreme examples of eating, like a troubled young Brit's diet on a binging day, a whopping 12,000 calories, or the 800 calories worth of corn, porridge, and milk our Maasai herder in Kenya ate one day during drought. These are not caloric averages. Others are more average or typical, like that of our Vietnamese rice farmer who eats the same rice-based fare with meat as a condiment day in and day out. Most of the calories they total They bunch up in the middle in the 2000s. Faith wrote the accompanying essays to provide context for the caloric totals, each diet, the culture, and circumstances. And this gleaned from months of work with subjects and translators as we worked to dissect regional recipes and culinary culture. But before we travel anywhere, we do an incredible amount of research about the topic we're going to cover, and then we pick our countries. Let's take a quick look at one of those that's been in the news recently, and that's Egypt. For what I eat, first we choose an occupation or a certain life circumstance in every country. In Cairo, we covered a young businessman and his day's worth of food in his downtown high-rise, and then we went looking for a camel broker outside the city. We chased down a subject, often not knowing in advance exactly who we'll end up with, which is part of the fun and part of the stress. At Burkash, we chose Salah Fadlallah. We show him photos of other people we've covered so that he understands the project. Faith interviews him extensively to learn all she can about his life and diet, and I spend much of the time photographing his daily life. Then we determine a location to make the photo, which is not always easy, as the background has to provide a frame of reference about the subject's occupation. Then I shoot the picture, usually with a lot of help and a lot of kibitzing from interested bystanders. Then we record the subject's age, height, and weight. After the food portrait, Faith determines the weights of every tiny bit of food using measuring tools and a digital scale, again, usually with lots of local help and advice. We work in our home office in Napa, California, where it takes months to organize the information and calculate the caloric value of every bit of food. Then our fact checkers get to work, and dietitians at UC Davis in California vet our food compositions and calorie totals. And so here are some of the people we profiled for What I Eat. For centuries, Pima Indians in Arizona were self-sufficient farmers with a talent for irrigation in a very harsh desert environment. But after the rivers were diverted by settlers and America's native people could no longer grow their own food, their traditional diet was replaced by foods full of processed flour, sugar, and lard. Over 20 years ago, I photographed a 41-year-old Pima man who was part of an NIH study aimed at discovering why the Pimas of Arizona have the highest recorded prevalence of diabetes in the world, with male life expectancy of less than 50 years. When we tried to find this same man for What I Eat, we discovered he had died just 5 years after the photo. We found another man of Pima heritage to cover in the U.S., and that was 30-year-old Louis Soto, a carpenter assistant who weighed 300 pounds at the time, suffered from type 2 diabetes, and was struggling to stick to a diet and exercise program. Mexican Pimas, though, are genetically similar to the Arizonans, but have virtually no type 2 diabetes, and researchers are also studying them to understand why they don't suffer from the same maladies as the genetically similar Pimas of Arizona. In What I Eat, we include indigenous rancher Jose Carrillo of the Mexican Sierras as a counterpoint. Quite obviously, the lifestyles and diets of Jose and Louis are a world apart. Jose in Mexico, the picture of health with his traditional diet and little processed food, supporting a physically active lifestyle. And then there's Louis in the U.S., much more sedentary and with his Western weight loss diet. He's still eating overly processed food, but now fewer calories than in the past, and he hopes now to live long enough to see his children grow up. There are many theories about why some populations are more overweight and prone to diabetes than others, but a balance of diet and physical activity seem to be a recipe for good health. This is easier to accomplish, of course, in places where physical labor is still the norm.
So you heard earlier that the Revis family shocked themselves into reworking their diet and exercise program. The effort is largely a modern countermechanism, a struggle to restore physical activity to the developed world's increasingly sedentary lifestyles. This is quite a difference from the lives of subsistence farmers, for instance, for whom physical exertion is a requirement for their family's survival. Physically demanding tasks are the norm in the developing world, like rice planting here in southern China and in Egypt. These are very grueling jobs, absolutely unrelenting. No matter the whim or the weather, the earth still has to be tilled, tended, and harvested if you want to feed your family. And after all that work, if something happens to the crop, all was for nothing, but everyone still has to eat. Luckily, though, most places where subsistence farmers live and work are part of a sharing and bartering culture by necessity. But whether purchased, borrowed, or homegrown, The staple grain still has to be milled by hand, or a portion handed over to a miller in exchange for the milling. When I asked one woman how many sacks of grain she thought she'd pounded in her life in her mother's house and then to feed her own family, after she stopped laughing at the question, could only come up with a lot. Although there is the confluence of work and exercise at some levels in the developed world, that's happening less and less. Many in China have figured out how to have both. Urban China has an amazing park culture centered on physical activity. But with rising income and diets transitioning to ones that embrace the global marketplace, the citizens of China and other emerging market economies are beginning to have to fight excess weight gain and diet-related illness. We covered 5 people in China from various regions around the country and 4 in India. In large countries, we'd cover several people to provide breadth and diversity. Call center operator Shashi Kanth here in Bangalore has a foot in 2 cultures, a balancing act that largely means managing his mother. At home, he eats traditional Mangalorean fare, fiery sambar spiced lentil stews, and sweet halvas, but he resists her attempts to pack traditional Indian food for him to take to work. He prefers eating fast food with his friends at the American-style fast food franchises on the ground floor of his high-rise workplace, and relies on candy bars and coffee to sustain him through his night, America's daylight hours. Far north of Bangalore, we covered Muna Kailash in north-central India. He's a bicycle rickshaw driver who burns every one of his 2,400 calories a day and could probably use a few more calories. Muna and his wife Mira live in a city holy to Hindus, Varanasi, where India comes to burn its dead on the banks of the Ganges River. The city's courtyards are used for cooking, visiting, and eating, and that's where we found Mira, who was cooking spicy soy protein curry and dal and fresh vegetables for her own family of devout Hindus who eat no meat, and for 2 doctors who live nearby. Her husband Muna is, in essence, the motor of his bicycle rickshaw, a very efficient calorie-burning machine. And so is bike messenger Yajima Jun of Japan, who during 10-hour days on the streets of Tokyo averages 50 miles a day. Jun and his colleagues compare notes on which foods and supplements will give them the most energy as they work. Things like high-protein natto, fermented soybean, and amino acid supplements, a specialized diet for a specific career. Japan, though, interests us on a lot of nutritional levels. We went to Okinawa because it has the highest percentage of 100-year-olds of any place on the planet. Although some of that spectacular fact may be fiction because of a little bit of questionable record keeping, the Japanese still hold the record for greatest overall longevity, said to be a combination of balanced diet and physical activity. We bumped into Haruko Maeda, age 890, who was clipping her lawn with garden shears in the heat of the day. As we worked our way around Ogimi Village, we met 96-year-old Matsu, who stopped for lunch with us at a local restaurant on the way to hoe her sweet potato patch. For the Japanese generally, there's a dietary credo that parents have taught their children for a long time, the phrase, harahachibu, or 80%, to eat only until 80% full, the concept of moderation and letting your stomach catch up with your brain. It helps that historically their diet has been rich in natural plant and fish nutrients and low in calories. Unfortunately, though, bigger, more highly processed meals are catching up with the Japanese as well. Those laudable longevity numbers are falling, and chronic diseases related to diet are on the increase.
Traveling much faster than the Tokyo bike messenger, but with horsepower under the hood and burning many fewer calories as a sedentary long-haul trucker, there's Namibian Terry Bezudenhout, who fuels himself with Red Bull to stay awake during the 22-hour shifts he drives on the Trans-Kalahari Highway. He pops the top off canned meatball stew and canned spaghetti and eats them cold, along with bags of snacks and sugar drinks, which on the day we covered him equaled 8,400 calories. It doesn't look like that many calories, but again, we're looking at a packaged diet for a captive consumer. At home, he eats traditional fare, a bit of meat and cornmeal porridge consisting of many fewer calories. Conrad Tolby of Mississippi says that he eats differently at home as well, but nutritious food is hard to find when you've got to park an 18-wheeler. There are other concerns as well. He's had 2 heart attacks in the cab of his truck. His calorie count for the day, 5,400 calories, fewer than you might think looking at the heavily fried food portrait, but most of his beverages are unsweetened. What's accessible on the road is truck stop fare and fast food joints. We found him in a truck stop getting ready to chow down on deep fried food with his dog, Fancy Pants. We explored the life and diet of a weight loss camper in the Catskills in New York State as well. Weight loss is a big business in the USA, and thousands of overweight teens, like Mackenzie here, attend these camps every summer. Some would say that a camp dedicated to weight loss isn't working if she has to always go back, but the high schooler says she appreciates the strict summer diet and exercise program. She reverts to her old eating habits during the school year. She says she'd weigh even more without the strict summer diets, though. Lunches at her grammar school were the beginning of her struggle with weight. Buffet style, all you could eat, and most of the choices, she says, were not healthy ones. Who were the easiest and the hardest people in the project to calculate? Iron worker Jeff Devine from Chicago was probably the easiest, and education consultant Millie Mitra from Bangalore, India, the hardest. Jeff's a bodybuilder who can't cook and eats his workday lunch, most days 50 stories up in the sky. All of his food is easy open package stuff. All that Faith and our editorial staff had to do was read the labels. Millie, vegetarian, employs a cook, has exacting tastes, and eats very small portions of many dishes that had to be deconstructed. She's the ultimate recycler, though, as she's a devotee of Shivambu. That's a practice written about in ancient Sanskrit texts in which you drink your own urine for therapeutic purposes, which she couldn't exactly identify, though she's been practicing this for 17 years. She offered to drink the tall glass of her own urine here for the photo.
Not my cup of tea, but onward to Brazil. The river system is the highway throughout much of Brazil's enormous state of Amazonas. We bring our own hammocks and swing for hours in steerage with hundreds who are doing the same, men and women carrying provisions home to their villages. Finally, we reach the small floating house of 69-year-old fisherman Joe Cardoso, which until recently was little more than a leaky shack. He built it with pension money that has begun to flow from the government to poor rural Brazilians. There's fishing in the early morning and swimming and bathing at the right time of day to avoid the piranhas. Yes, that's Peter diving in there. Fish is still the staple food, along with manioc flour, but now there's also packaged cookies and crackers and candy, a sugary drink called Windy, and his new favorite, pasta. He ate significantly fewer calories before his pension kicked in. The increased income means that his choices have expanded, but they're not always good ones. 2 hours upriver from Joe's floating house, do we cover the jaguar-killing rancher or Solange, his wife? I opt for Solange, who's raising their grandchildren, cooking for them and cleaning and seeing them off in their canoe for the ride around the bend to the village school. Her husband provides the comic relief during the interview when he comes in and questions what she reports that she eats of the sweets and the other good-tasting things in the house. Solange, it turns out, eats many more tucumã fruits and much more cornmeal cake than she first reported. She also drinks far more soda. But in the end, we get to a good food list. Sometimes a list of food seems more like a negotiation, but ultimately, as journalists who can sort of spot these things, we get to the truth with follow-up and input from family and friends. And that turtle tied to the kitchen table, it will become soup for a grandson's birthday. At dusk, the mosquitoes come out to feed, and with no screens on the house, just about every family member here has had malaria.
From one of the least densely populated river systems to one of the most, Bangladesh. It's the most densely populated country on the planet, with devastating poverty and a threatening sea level. We cover Alamin Hassan, age 12. The boy had run away from home on the roof of the train to the big city to escape chronic hunger, but he never left the station. We'd planned to cover a pavement dweller, one of thousands living on the streets of Dhaka. But as often happens, a compelling story caught up with us. That was Alamin's. As a runaway, Alamin is eating more than he had in his mother's house. Now it's 2 large plates a day of vegetable curry, sweet tea, and rice. But it's a dicey proposition for a 12-year-old. There's theft of his money while he sleeps, and he has to battle with older boys and men, all struggling to earn the same meager living. Ruma Atkar and her parents escaped to Dhaka together, trading their village home and lives as subsistence farmers for an 8-foot square rented room in a tenement. Thousands of Bengalis like the Akhtars stream into Dhaka each year looking for a better life. Not everyone finds one. A garment worker, since the age of 15, she and her father, a rickshaw driver, are the breadwinners of the family, making roughly $60 a month each. Formal education ended when Ruma went to work, but she much prefers her life in the city, despite the fact that their home is now surrounded by much of the city's trash. The promise of microlending started in Bangladesh with the Grameen Bank, and now there are others. Shanaz Begum's family here doesn't drink the milk from the dairy cow that she bought with BRAC microloan money. They sell it. Life in Bangladesh is still a daily struggle for survival, but microlending to women has made a real difference for families there. A struggle for a different nature back here in the United States. 468-pound Rick Baumgardner, shown here with his weight loss diet, only 1,600 calories a day, because he was trying to qualify for gastric bypass surgery. His dietary downfall was his first job out of high school, delivering milk through the local school system, trading it for ice cream for other drivers, and eating lunch at every school cafeteria stop. Largely immobilized, suffering from a bad back and type 2 diabetes, which he's treating here, he had to lose 100 pounds to be eligible for the surgery and struggled for years to do so. His favorite snack? Just give me a jar of mayonnaise, a package of saltine crackers, and a long-handled spoon, and I'll be happy, he told us. After years spent trying to stick to a pre-surgical diet, he finally received gastric banding surgery. It was a life-changing event for Rick, but still just a step in a lifelong struggle with overeating.
So, Londoner Jill McTighe here bravely shared her troubled relationship with drug abuse and food. So this is her binging day, over 12,000 calories. She wanted to look like the actresses and models that she saw on TV, and she used speed to try to be as thin as they were. She reveled in the calls and the whistles on the street when she was at her skinniest, calling them lovely, but says she was warned by her mother she'd be dead within the year if she continued her drug use. She pulls out her old size 8 jeans and the one she wears now, size 16, and compares them. Still wistful about the change, but no longer starving herself with drugs. I was never meant to be a size 8, she says. When we met her, she had begun to learn that her behavior was unsustainable, but was still using food as comfort. Since we did the coverage, she's gotten counseling, thrown out the deep fryer, and when last we spoke was trying out the Special K diet and tackling her demons. Of course, demons come in all shapes and sizes. Like Jill, Marielle Booth, a professional model in New York City, struggles with what she weighs and what she'd like to weigh. She eats healthy food, but too much, she thinks. She has a hard time reconciling the fact that she's at the perfect weight for her body type, but unable to fit into the size 0 clothes she'd need to wear to get the high fashion modeling job she craves. 0 is the size that's prized. That's what's so annoying, she says. I'm a size 4, which is a really bad size for modeling. It's totally irresponsible for me to be the weight I am. If I lost 5 pounds, I'd probably make a lot more money. On the other side of the world, on the Arabian Peninsula, in one of the world's most beautiful and most dangerous capital cities, we bridge a deep cultural divide when we interview and photograph a covered woman, 27-year-old Sada, in Yemen's capital city, Sana'a. She's veiled, as is just about every other Yemeni woman in the city when she's out in public, in accordance with the strict conservative culture, and had never before been face-to-face uncovered with male non-family members before. It was extremely difficult for us to find a man who would allow his wife to be photographed or interviewed. Her husband's income as a banker's driver means that Sada eats many more calories than she did when living in her family's poor rural village 6 hours south. We also cover merchant Ahmed Suede, whose business is khat, a leafy Arabian shrub which is widely chewed as an amphetamine-like stimulant in the desert kingdom. As Ahmed is more conservative than Sada's husband, Peter can't meet Ahmed's wife in their home. We settle for hauling his day's worth of food to a nearby rooftop for the picture. The khat that Ahmed sells is a very big business, but it's draining that country dry of water, and most of Yemen's food, upwards of 98%, must now be imported. So in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post in 2008, I described the increasing concern of average Yemenis about the alarming rise in the price of basic foodstuffs. They're a prisoner of their government's policies, world markets, and their water crisis. Yemeni concern turned into riots even before the Arab Spring. Drought alone is devastating, but often fleeting. Herds die off but are built back up over time. Agriculture reemerges. We saw the downside in a Maasai village in East Africa where drought was in the process of decimating their substantial cattle herds. We saw the upside in West Africa with the Himba in Namibia where the seasonal rains were normal. Their herds were healthy and providing lots of milk. In the 80s, though, they, like the Maasai, lost all of their animals to drought. Historically, both they and the Maasai existed on meat and milk, but now the mainstay in both cultures is cornmeal-based porridge, that universal remediation agent. Increasing desertification, however, is changing the equation. Competition for ever-decreasing amounts of arable land is fueling conflict, and the most marginalized of humans have no political power. In a remote Himba village in Namibia near the Angola border, we find Viandera, a 23-year-old mother of 3, who lives a pastoral life still steeped in the ways of her ancestors, and who covers herself with ochre and butterfat to both beautify and guard against the sun. The Himba culture is on the cusp of change as more and more of its people don Western clothes and take modern jobs and adopt modern vices. But for most, cows are still the treasured currency and milk the staple food along with porridge. And the corral is the center of the village's universe. Viandera's diet is fermented milk, seasonal berries, and cornmeal porridge. When did she last have meat? She loves it, but she can't remember. The eating of their treasured animals is reserved for special occasions. Her father says that when he slaughters a goat, she and her brother are first in line and can finish the whole thing body and bones. So what have we learned in our travels and in doing these books? Certainly we've learned that moderation in diet is best and physical activity crucial. Of course, that's very easy to say and not so easy to do. We've also learned that seeing all the food you eat in 1 week's time, all at one time, or even an entire day's worth can be a life changer for some people. But while some of us have figured out the tools that they need to eat healthfully, there are a lot of reasons why we have a long way to go. When I asked the Pima Indian Luis Soto whether in his quest for a healthier diet, he was eating more fresh vegetables, he said they'd tried, but they were too expensive, so they went back to what he called regular food. We've also learned that affording people the opportunity to examine so many diets presented in a non-judgmental way allows them to compare and contrast one to another and to their own diet as well, with fascination, not fear. But perhaps most importantly, we've seen that where traditional activity and diet is largely still the norm, even impoverished people eating a moderate grain and or plant-based diet are eating relatively more healthfully than most Americans. Of course, without access to clean water and good health care, these people all have other issues to contend with.
Here in the USA, we have magnificently advanced and expensive medical technology to take care of diseases, mostly after they appear. We spend twice as much per person on healthcare than any other country, but we aren't any healthier. In fact, the CDC says that half the chronic diseases Americans suffer from are diet-related. Even in these troubling economic times, though, the developing world has an abundance of food. We figured out food preservation, transportation, industrialization. Coordination of all these, though, is a challenge. Sometimes the quotas that are in place to stabilize prices lead to waste, and subsidies can become entrenched and counterproductive. This huge pile of carrots is an example in California, planted to feed people but destined for cattle now because the market would be flooded if they hit the supermarket. The same goes for oranges and dozens of other crops. In the marketplace, we have companies competing for every penny of our food dollar and introducing new product after new product. This gives us choice, but does it really? Some of us suddenly understand that what we're actually choosing from is a list of questionable options, highly processed, calorie-dense, non-nutritive options for ourselves, and that we export around the world. Theoretically, it's a matter of making better personal choices hopefully more rational choices, and then having those better choices drive the market and lead the companies that feed us to provide healthier food. It may cost more initially, but in the long haul, it could be much more cost effective, and the result could result in truly happier meals and lives for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really apologize for my voice, although it was a lot harder on me than it was on you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have any questions, Lisa?
Yep, we have some mics in the audience, so anyone with a question, just raise your hand. Okay.
Hi, based on everything you've learned, what do you choose to eat? What kind of a diet do you eat?
Peter likes to say he chooses to eat less meat, but I haven't really seen a lot of indication of that.
No, it's sort of true. Red meat once a week, and a lot more fish, but a lot of vegetables. And for the past, ever since we've known each other for the last 20 years, when we go into a restaurant, we usually order one main dish and share it, and then we have a salad, and Faith has about 4 glasses of wine, so that's what, that's the secret of her beauty.
You are so in trouble.
Mm-hmm. No, but seriously, we have a big garden at home, and we did take a lot away from Okinawa in that harahajibu phrase. Moderation, you could eat anything you want in moderation and still be healthy. I mean, there are people that have done these crazy diets with, with Jack in the Box and Wendy's and all that, and they're still alive. So, it's just a matter of...
The body is a very forgiving thing. What we've learned as we've gotten older is that we really just don't need as much food, and I think we don't really use food to soothe ourselves. Certainly we have certain things that are comfort food for us, but mostly moderation really is the key, and eating mindfully. Really, sort of knowing what we're eating. We don't really ever eat without knowing that we're eating. And there are so many people that we've sat with, mostly in this country. We covered, I think, 20 people, right, for this, for what I eat. And that happens a lot, where people eat at their desk and, sort of just pick up food. Food is available everywhere in this country, and you just don't really see that in a lot of places. It's actually happening more and more, but it's, and there's no such thing as holiday food anymore, or special food. Every day, you can have dessert every day. I don't remember that growing up. I don't know, my father's in the audience. He might, although he thinks, I've always said he thinks Cool Whip is a food group, so don't ask him.
So my question is with shopping, something that I didn't think about before when I was just reading through Around the World in 80 Diets, but that hit me today is in Metro Boston, we talk a lot about people's food options, people who live in Metro Boston, where can they buy their food? And we talk about processed food in grocery stores and in smaller shops, and we talk about farmers markets. And there tends to be this dividing line between packaged food and fresh whole food. And I didn't think about it until I was looking at the photos today, but I noticed that same divide when I was studying abroad in Ghana. If you go through a market, some stalls are whole food, they're all fruits, they're all vegetables, they're grains, and other stalls are all processed food. And I'm just curious if you could comment on that aspect of the food supply and that division between whole food and processed food, just what you've noticed.
It's true. We actually divided even further because there's actually nothing wrong with processed food. It's highly processed food we have a problem with. Things where you're eating from a box, where you've got a list of ingredients, and if I can't pronounce them, or if we actually sort of use 2 or 3 ingredients, if there's more than that, if I can't readily identify what it is, then I probably shouldn't be eating it. So that's one thing. So I think you're exactly right. I'm sure Ghana is a perfect example of that. But what we have found in the developed world, so-called developed world, is this idea that we talked about choice is really false choice. Do we really need 600,000 different varieties of yogurt? I am so tired of having to figure out what has aspartame, since they no longer have to put it on the label. Is that, I sort of have to keep looking. Okay, I have to sort of seek out now the organic label, whereas I might be much more happy just seeking out the local label, but that's harder and harder to do, is sort of figuring things out. We all have a very tough road because we don't get a lot of help. We are lucky because we have got some pretty good nutritionists in this country, but unfortunately they are pretty overwhelmed by some of the food lobby groups that are just, turning our school lunches into very, very strange things. But, your question about shopping, I think that's nothing, you guys are we're preaching to the choir here. The fact that you're here, you already sort of know what you're up against, I think. Generally, when you go into a supermarket, you're going into battle. And a supermarket is exactly that, a supermarket, super something, hypermarkets. The French, people are surprised maybe to learn, the French have these giant hypermarkets, and they are throughout the world, more so than Walmart. It's really sort of freaky if you're driving along through the desert in Egypt between
Cairo and
Alexandria, and all of a sudden you come upon this building that is the size of 4 football fields. You couldn't possibly get from one side to the other in less than an hour, and it's a French hypermarket, and everybody's shopping there. And it's quite a bit different than where they would be shopping, in their own neighborhood. But it was a big draw, and that's happening more and more.
Hi. I was also thinking about shopping and how it's related to food and overweight. And, we're in such a shopping culture, and I was wondering if there was a correlation in your work. Like I noticed in the pictures that, like, societies where you go do the big shopping and you buy 2 weeks worth of food, and then I was raised not to throw food away and not to waste any food on my plate. So what I try to do now is like just buy smaller amounts for what I know I'm going to cook and eat, and only what I really need. And yeah, you might have to have more trips, but in the end, you buy less, you eat less, and it's healthier. And I think about in Europe and like just going to the little markets and getting the beautiful local things. It really makes a difference.
There was a lot of resistance in Hungry Planet when we asked the family to buy an entire week's worth of food. We never buy a whole week's worth of food, and a lot of people said, no, we're not going to buy a whole week's worth of
It's
bread.
very difficult.
Can't I buy one day and you
Can't
sort
we
of
show one loaf of bread
one loaf
instead
of bread and then
you
you just do the Jesus thing? But it didn't work out that way. We had to buy that much bread, and then we made sure that they gave it to their neighbors, or that we all sat there for the next 2 days and ate the bread. But places, you're right, things like Costco, which save us so much money when we can buy 60 pounds of chicken and bring it home, and waste half of it. Those are the things that are spreading around the world. And Faith's comment about the hypermarkets, they're all over China now. It's changing the planet. The huge shops and marketing, and it's just changing.
It's completely replacing, local
The
family
mom and pops.
and
Which makes it cheaper for people. So it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's more economical, but it may be not as healthy, and it's not maybe as good for the local economy. So you got to look at all sides of a question like that.
yeah. But I think you're exactly right, Laurie.
We have a question in the front. Shopping again. I was horrified last weekend to go into the Star Market and in the dairy case see a new product, 2 new products, tiny containers with, I would say, between 3 and 4 ounces of some kind of yogurt in them. And on the top, you could choose between either a big bunch of M&Ms or crushed Oreos. And the words on it suggested that parents have asked us to provide a healthy food that their children will actually eat. And I was really enraged. I really was. What I wanted to do was buy the whole package and throw it away. And I thought, well, no, they'll just put it on again. And it's also the cereals that I think were advertised at the Super Bowl called Crave, K-R-A-V, new cereal. It's a wheat coating around a chocolate filling.
Oh my God.
And you can get either the plain or you can get the double chocolate, which has chocolate wheat covering around a chocolate filling.
Oh, well, that makes
Sure.
me really happy.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
I have
Okay.
to try that.
Yeah, really, really.
But, there's-
She's not going to stay with you if you do that.
Yeah, there's fast food places too that have, meat on the outside of something.
Yeah, stuffed everything.
I mean, gosh.
My question is, I was so angry at the companies that continue upping the ante all the time, all the time. You can't just buy a plain cookie anymore. It's got to have a candy coating and God knows what kind of stuff. And I'm wondering, where can you put pressure on the so-called food companies to stop inventing these non-foods and pushing them on people?
You know what?
Good
People
luck.
much bigger than we are really trying their hardest. You know, I think Michael Pollan is one of the most eloquent speakers on that subject, and he has a hard time. Everybody does, because we're up against something that is actually quite frightening. And I think, you know, younger generations don't really know what real food is, and that's easy for us old people to say, right? Exactly, and it's, you know, it's a little bit scary. I think that there certainly are parents who are paying attention, but I also think that, you know, there's a lot of babysitter food out there that is just, it isn't food, and it is what Michael Pollan calls edible food-like substances, and it's killing us. And, you know, I'd love to be able to say that we have the answers. Really what we try to do with our work is, again, as we say a few times in the show, is really to present it as really non-polemically as possible, mostly to get people like you thinking about it, but also to get people not like you to think about it, people who don't really think about their diet. And they really do. If you see, I mean, I think the people here at the museum who did such a nice job with our exhibit here say that you know, they've got school groups that go through here, and they've got, I can't remember what the term they use, but it basically it's like hang time. They've got great hang time, and people actually read the captions, which doesn't usually happen in a museum. And they were kind of astonished that people were spending as much time looking at the pictures. And those, I mean, you know, Peter is a compelling photographer. Yes, I'll give him that once. But it is also about the idea of sort of seeing people like you and people not like you, and making a jump educationally.
They're just trying to make sense of the captions, Faith. It's kind of confusing. No, but seriously, I'm on a personal, you know, on a professional level, we try to be as non-judgmental as possible. But on a personal level, I'm agreeing with a lot of people now, including Mark Bittman and some other people, that are advocating that, you know, we start looking at some of the food problems or like Robert Lustig with sugar, where we look at some of these problems and we sort of make the analogy of tobacco, you know, 20 or 30 years ago. And it's time that I think that some really strong labeling and maybe some taxing and some other intervention happens on a government level to make things either more expensive or to, you know, maybe you have to be 60 to buy something, you know?
I don't really hold out much hope, you know. I mean, I feel a little bit fatalistic. I don't know how much worse it has to get before things do change, but I think a lot of it does come down to education. The only thing that's going to stop people from making that crap is for people to stop buying it, and I just don't see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to take one last question up here before heading into the gallery.
Actually, I have two questions. I hope that's fine. First of all, thanks a lot. You just mentioned it. What do you think about these food labeling systems, so like traffic light systems or other ways to label the food and to make it easier to identify good food? And then my second question would be, what do you think is so attractive? So why are these so-called undeveloped countries following us developed countries and eating bad, trashy food?
Yeah, why is the Western diet taking over the world? Partly it's because of food companies and because we're hardwired to want sugar, fat, and salt, because those substances really pack the most calories and they're the most dense food substances known. And you know, when we needed to consume things that had a lot of power to keep us going, those were the things that we sought. One of the, you know, in the book, we've got about 7 or 8 essays, and one of the interesting ones I think is Richard Wrangham, who wrote Catching Fire, how humans learned to cook and how we're the first species we're the only species that cooks. And one of the things that, I can't remember if it's in the essay or that he told me or it's in his book, but chimpanzees that he was studying in Africa, he noticed that they were going after, you know, fruit that, you know, didn't look good, but that was partly spoiled and that had worms in it because it was sweet, it had the most sugar content, and the added attraction of having a little bit of protein inside. So, you know, we're hardwired for this stuff, except, you know, we shouldn't be anymore because we have, the choice is there and there's too much of it. It's the same, we've got to get over some of these you know, things that we really believe in as being truths. Actually, I should get off this soapbox.
We basically, you know, the upshot is that we as people living here, we just don't have that much of a voice. And
but the
it'd
food
be nice to see
labeling,
that
the food labeling could be so much better. I mean, the food pyramid was such a joke in this country for so many years, and the whole thing was orchestrated by, you know, food lobby, by different.
it wasn't orchestrated by them. It was certainly impacted, to a great level by them.
They rigged it.
My role. Okay.
But there's a lot of room for better packaging and labeling for
So
sure.
I think we're going to head to the gallery and answer more
Yeah.
questions or whatever you guys want to talk about.
Yeah,
Okay?
I mean, that was just amazing. Thank you, guys.